Yes, I'm sure it's a tip. I mean, all the things, I spent 4 years researching this book, but I mean, even so, it's only the testimony of the people I found, and I only had 300 people out of 3,000 people that I identified and approached. And we have clearly some legal depositions, we have some cuts.
A carefully staged calm surrounds Prince Andrew, but beneath it, troubling claims are beginning to unravel. For years, Buckingham Palace maintained a strategic silence, keeping controversy at bay. Yet recent appearances alongside Sarah Ferguson have stirred renewed scrutiny. Now, former insiders describe unsettling routines, strict displays of dominance, and moments that allegedly crossed a line many never expected. As these accounts rise, a chilling thought emerges. Were these acts of power quietly enforced all along? Prince Andrew's unbelievable demands. For years, it seems we've only glimpsed the surface of something deeper. Behind Buckingham Palace's quiet walls, moves have been made to shift focus from Prince Andrew, reducing his public appearances and keeping him distant from major royal events. Silence, in this case, has only sparked more curiosity. Then, a subtle but notable moment. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson appeared together publicly for the first time since losing their royal roles and honors. It wasn't grand. No palace balcony waves, no cheering crowds, just a brief attendance at their granddaughter's christening. What drew attention wasn't their presence, but their absence afterward. While the family continued celebrations at a nearby pub, Andrew and Sarah quietly left. Was it discomfort, avoidance, or something more hidden behind the palace doors? Because at the very moment they seemed to be presenting a calm and controlled image, a fresh wave of troubling claims began circulating again. These weren't vague rumors drifting through tabloids. They were detailed accounts, descriptions of behavior that painted a far more unsettling picture, stories of sudden outbursts, strict and unusual demands, and staff members pushed to emotional breaking points started resurfacing with renewed intensity. What makes this even more striking is that these claims are not being dismissed as outdated gossip. Instead, they are gaining traction, largely fueled by a book that has kept the conversation alive weeks after its release. The narrative within it doesn't just revisit the past, it adds layers to it, supported by voices of individuals who claim to have witnessed these moments firsthand. According to these accounts, Andrew was deeply fixated on hierarchy and control. Staff members reportedly described an environment where even the smallest gestures carried heavy meaning. Something as simple as entering a room became a test of obedience, with expectations that bows had to be performed correctly and repeated if they fell short. It wasn't described as tradition or formality, but as something more rigid, more demanding. There are also claims of a temper that could quickly escalate when expectations are not met. Moments of tension that went beyond simple frustration, creating an atmosphere that left people uneasy. Even more surprising are the smaller, almost unbelievable stories that suggest decisions were sometimes made based on personal preferences rather than any formal rule. A staff member was allegedly dismissed over a minor physical detail. Another, reportedly, was removed for something as trivial as a clothing choice. And then there are the daily routines, details that might seem small at first, but begin to feel heavier when looked at closely. Requests that could easily be handled independently, yet were passed on to staff in ways that made the act of service feel less like duty and more like an obligation for its own sake. Tasks repeated not out of necessity, but expectation. Some of the accounts take an even stranger turn. Late-night calls for assistance with simple tasks. Highly trained officers have reportedly been given responsibilities far outside their official roles. Each story adds another layer, making it harder to separate what feels exaggerated from what might actually be real. The timing of all this only deepens the tension. In the past, when similar concerns were raised about others within the royal circle, formal investigations were launched, processes were followed, statements were made. But here, there seems to be a noticeable difference. Quiet discussions, unconfirmed preparations, but no official acknowledgement in the same way. That contrast has not gone unnoticed, and it continues to raise difficult questions. Today, Andrew's position is very different from what it once was. His titles are no longer in use, his public duties have disappeared, and there are growing suggestions that even within the royal family, patience has worn thin. The monarchy itself is already under pressure, facing challenges that require stability, not distraction. Yet despite all this, that brief appearance at the christening sends a clear message. He has not completely stepped away. He remains present, still connected, still capable of drawing attention at moments when the institution can least afford it. And just as these revelations begin to settle in, another layer starts to emerge, one that shifts the focus in an unexpected direction. Sarah Ferguson broke down emotionally. What really pushed her to that edge? And is this just the beginning of an even deeper unraveling? Keep watching to find out. Sarah Ferguson on the edge. Behind the polished walls of royal life, the strain is no longer hidden, and for Sarah Ferguson, it appears to be reaching a breaking point. Those close to her have begun to whisper about growing concern, describing a woman weighed down not just by public judgment, but by something deeper, something far more personal. It's not just the headlines. It's the way those headlines keep pulling her family back into a storm they thought had already passed. The pressure is constant. Every resurfaced story, every revived accusation, doesn't just target Prince Andrew, it circles back to her, to their daughters, and to a past that refuses to stay buried. Imagine trying to rebuild your life while the world insists on reopening old wounds. For Sarah, that emotional toll is becoming harder to carry, especially as the scrutiny intensifies and the spotlight grows harsher with each passing day. There's also a shared frustration between her and Andrew, a belief that no matter how much time passes, they are being punished over and over again for the same chapter. Titles have already been stripped away. Public respect has taken a severe hit. Yet the cycle continues, as if closure is something they are simply not allowed to have. But from inside palace circles, the approach isn't seen as punishment. It's something colder, more calculated, containment. The royal institution, already walking a fragile line with public trust, has little tolerance for fresh controversy. With major events on the horizon and scrutiny at an all-time high, the goal is simple: keep things quiet, controlled, and as far from scandal as possible. But that becomes nearly impossible when the past refuses to stay in the past. Because recently, something changed. Images, previously unseen by the public, have begun circulating again. Photographs linking Andrew to Jeffrey Epstein have resurfaced, and they are not being treated as distant relics anymore. Instead, they are being examined under a new, sharper lens. In these images, Andrew appears relaxed, familiar, even comfortable in settings that now raise serious questions. And that's where the real shift begins. While Andrew has consistently denied any wrongdoing, these pictures carry a weight that words often cannot. They don't make direct accusations, but they do something arguably more powerful. They reinforce a narrative many people already suspect, a narrative shaped by years of whispers, claims from former staff, and stories about how power was exercised behind closed doors. According to those accounts, Andrew was a man who expected control, who demanded a certain level of obedience, and who operated with a sense of authority that few dared to challenge. Now, when people look at these photographs, they don't see isolated moments frozen in time. They see confirmation. They connect the man in the images with the stories they've heard, blending perception and reality into something difficult to separate. And that's the problem, because once that line is blurred, public opinion hardens. It becomes less about proving specific claims and more about the overall picture being formed. The media has begun to reflect this shift as well. These images are no longer treated as old news. Instead, they are framed as part of an ongoing story, one that has never truly been resolved. Experts and commentators have pointed out that the real issue isn't just what can be proven, but what continues to resurface. Every time these images reappear, they reignite questions about judgment, choices, and the company Andrew kept. They challenge the idea that this is all in the past, suggesting instead that the past is still very much alive in the public mind. And perhaps most striking of all is how perception has evolved. For many observers, there is no longer a clear distinction between the figure seen in those photographs and the person described by former staff. The two have merged into a single troubling image, one that is difficult to shake. And as the tension mounts with past scandals crashing into the present, one question lingers. How did it ever spiral into this? Could the seeds of this unraveling have been sown long before anyone realized? Let's trace this turmoil back to its roots and uncover how early cracks may have quietly set the stage for the chaos we witness today. From childhood privilege to staff abuse. From the very moment Prince Andrew entered the world, life had already written a special script for him, one gilded in marble, wrapped in silk, and framed by golden ceilings. Rules, traditions, and expectations existed, but only for everyone else. For Andrew, privilege was a shield, one so thick that reality itself seemed powerless to pierce it. Yet what began as protection slowly morphed into a cage, a framework of entitlement and expectation that would shape him in ways no one could have predicted. By the age of 65, the once charming royal son, long celebrated as the monarchy's golden soldier, had become its most conspicuous failure, a figure whose missteps and scandals would cast long shadows over the crown. Even as a child, Andrew's lessons in power were learned not from guidance, but from testing boundaries. Observers and palace staff painted a vivid picture of a boy for whom rules were optional. Before headlines, interviews, or scandals, he was already practicing the dangerous art of entitlement. At Windsor Castle, barely 5 years old, he would parade through the stables where grooms labored, swinging sticks at horses, taunting dogs, and mocking the soldiers lined in strict formation. When staff intervened, urging him to stop, he only escalated. One day, 2 exasperated grooms, desperate to curb his misbehavior, lifted the little prince and dropped him unceremoniously into a pile of manure. For most children, such a lesson might have humbled them. For Andrew, it was confirmation. Humiliation is temporary, privilege is permanent. A few years later, another pivotal moment cemented his understanding of power and consequence. In a fit of defiance, he goaded a footman so relentlessly that the man, breaking protocol, struck Andrew in the face, leaving a bruise. Shock rippled through the palace. Yet when the servant offered his resignation, the queen refused it, noting that Andrew had provoked the incident. The footman remained, Andrew recovered, and a silent rule was set in stone. He could incite others, even to violence, without facing accountability. The lesson was unmistakable. His influence depended not on kindness or restraint, but on daring others to challenge him, knowing he would remain untouchable. These early episodes were far from innocent. They sketched the outline of a future defined by control and caprice. The boy who mocked soldiers grew into a man who demanded curtains drawn with exacting precision, berating staff for leaving even the slightest gap. The child who tormented animals became a grown man who insisted teddy bears be arranged in strict formations, erupting into tantrums when standards were not met. To outsiders, these quirks seemed amusing or eccentric, but to those who served him, they were daily experiences of humiliation, petty, unrelenting, and cruel. By the early 1980s, the contrast between Andrew and the beloved Princess Diana was stark. Where Diana embodied charm and empathy, Andrew cultivated arrogance and entitlement. His reputation as the charismatic younger prince was overshadowed by tales of cruelty towards staff. Former maid Charlotte Briggs recalled trembling under his fury for a minor mistake with curtains, a stark reminder of how trivial lapses became arenas for his intimidation. The pattern persisted. Fits of rage, obsessive demands, and meticulous control over even the smallest details revealed a man who had never outgrown the bratty audacity of the 5-year-old who mocked Windsor soldiers. Indulgence from the Queen excused him, while Prince Philip's dismissive labeling of Andrew as the spare reinforced the idea that accountability was optional. With wealth, influence, and royal blood as shields, he navigated life untouchable, until those cracks began to show. Randy Andy, once the glamorous, carefree prince, became a figure defined by rumors, missteps, and public shame. The trajectory from childhood arrogance to adult recklessness had been set early, with each tantrum, prank, and provocation contributing to a broader narrative of entitlement and impunity. The boy who once tormented staff and animals was now a man whose private actions would spill into public scandal, threatening not just his reputation, But the image of the monarchy itself, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Now the full story emerges, painful, shocking, and unsettling details that many hoped would stay buried. Former insiders are stepping forward, ready to expose secrets long kept behind palace walls. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew. Prince Andrew's private reign. Behind the gleaming gates, immaculate floors, and carefully choreographed public moments, another, far darker story quietly unfolded, a story palace staff say they endured in silence for years. At the center was Prince Andrew, once one of Britain's most prominent royals. But the man staff met behind closed doors, according to former aides, protection officers, and insiders, was said to be a world apart from the polished public image. The accounts are chilling. Verbal abuse was not occasional or fleeting. It was routine, a constant undercurrent. Minor mistakes, a misplaced item, a slight delay, a small oversight, allegedly triggered sharp outbursts. Correction was rare. Insults, humiliation, and intimidation were the rule. One reported incident, highlighted in a documentary, involved Andrew allegedly calling a staff member a degrading, weight-focused slur. It wasn't only the words themselves that left colleagues shocked, it was the imbalance of power. When a prince attacks you verbally, where could one turn? Who could intervene? Staff reportedly lived in a state of perpetual tension. Andrew's temper could erupt without warning. Routine requests might escalate into shouting matches. Small misunderstandings could become public humiliations. In a palace where hierarchy defined status, the consequences of missteps were lasting and unavoidable. Several former employees described the atmosphere as taut, an invisible weight pressing down whenever Andrew entered a room. Staff would straighten up instantly, double-check every detail, bracing for scrutiny. Subtle intimidation reportedly amplified the strain. A glare, a dismissive gesture, an order delivered without eye contact. These small, repeated behaviors could erode morale faster than any overt outburst. Some staff even adjusted schedules to avoid crossing his path. A former protection officer described Andrew as a horrible little man, not in stature but in character. Those beneath him, the officer said, were treated as disposable, existing only to obey without question. Fear prevented formal complaints. In the royal household, loyalty and discretion aren't optional, they're survival tools. Careers could be made or broken based on reputation alone. Speaking against a senior royal risked professional exile. This culture of silence allowed alleged abuses to persist, with entitlement at its core. A prince by birth, son of the Queen, Andrew was reportedly accustomed to deference, insulated from consequences, and unchecked for years. Staff recounted long nights, abrupt orders, and public reprimands. Some were treated as incompetent, even when tasks were completed perfectly. Others quietly suffered the emotional weight of constant pressure, dreading each workday. Imagine preparing a room to perfection, only to risk verbal assault over a perceived flaw, or standing by at an event, acknowledged solely when something went wrong. That persistent tension became more than stress. It became fear, the unspoken law of daily life in the palace. What makes these revelations particularly stark is their consistency. Multiple accounts describe the same patterns: repeated demands, constant scrutiny, and the same dismissive attitude toward staff whose work underpinned the monarchy's smooth public image. Morale reportedly sank whenever Andrew engaged in royal duties. Some quietly requested transfers, while others endured in silence, seeing no alternative if they wished to maintain their careers. Over time, as unrelated royal scandals dominated headlines, the barrier of fear began to crack. Staff gradually started to speak more openly, revealing the hidden cost of Andrew's private conduct. These testimonies collectively paint a portrait of unchecked privilege, intimidation, and entitlement, a reminder that the public face of royalty often masks a more complex, sometimes disturbing, reality. Amid all this, many palace staff remained silent, bound by strict agreements signed the moment they were hired. So, what unspoken rules must they obey behind these gilded doors? And what really happens when someone dares to break them? Stay tuned, because inside the palace, the consequences are far more chilling than anyone outside could imagine. The hidden rules staff were forced to follow. A carefully staged calm surrounds Prince Andrew, yet behind the polished appearances, a storm of unsettling revelations is quietly taking shape. For decades, Buckingham Palace has relied on secrecy, maintaining an almost ritualistic silence whenever controversy threatened to breach its walls. Staff members, bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, are legally forbidden from speaking out, their voices muted by both fear and formal obligation. But what happens when whispers from the corridors of power finally start to leak into the public eye? Former aides describe a world where rigid obedience was not merely expected, it was demanded. Daily routines were peppered with eccentric and exacting instructions, each seemingly minor act a test of loyalty and submission. Reports claim that some staff were forced to repeat gestures or formalities until they met Andrew's satisfaction, while even trivial deviations could provoke explosive anger. For those living under such scrutiny, the line between disciplined service and outright humiliation became increasingly blurred. Were these rituals truly a matter of royal protocol, or had tradition become a thin veneer for control? The power dynamics within the household reveal an unsettling tension between public image and private behavior. On the surface, appearances remained composed. Low-key engagements with Sarah Ferguson, discreet family gatherings, and carefully choreographed outings projected a sense of normalcy. Yet insiders recount a very different reality. Staff navigating a maze of constant oversight, emotional pressure, and sometimes outright demeaning demands. Tasks as mundane as opening curtains, retrieving lost items, or adjusting personal attire reportedly became symbols of subservience, highlighting how privilege and hierarchy could transform ordinary expectations into acts of dominance. Legally binding agreements, like NDAs, amplify this culture of silence. Many who witness or endure misconduct cannot share their experiences, even after leaving royal service. This raises a troubling question. How many incidents, how many private humiliations have never reached public scrutiny simply because staff lacked the freedom to speak? The effect is a dual narrative, one carefully curated by the palace, the other whispered by those constrained by legal obligation. And in the case of Andrew, the contrast is stark. Decades of reported strictness now collide with public images and renewed scrutiny that are impossible to suppress entirely. Yet this is not merely a story about secrecy, it is also a debate over the nature of authority itself. Royals operate within traditions that command respect and demand protocol, but at what point does strictness cross into abuse? Former staff have recounted incidents so peculiar and demeaning that even seasoned aides reportedly found them astonishing. Each order, each repetition of ritual, each seemingly arbitrary dismissal raises a question about the boundaries of acceptable behavior in one of the most scrutinized households in the world. Are these actions the result of an old-world sense of discipline, or do they reflect a troubling misuse of power that has been allowed to flourish behind gilded doors? Adding to the tension is the context of Andrew's diminished public role. Titles stripped, official duties rescinded, and a reputation tarnished, his presence is nonetheless capable of diverting attention, forcing the monarchy to contend with both the optics and the reality of his conduct. Insiders note that the psychological weight of these dynamics extends beyond staff, reaching relatives, friends, and even public perception. Each disclosure, every resurfaced story, creates ripples that are difficult to contain, and each forced act of obedience now reads less like tradition and more like coercion. As we examine these hidden dynamics, it becomes clear that the palace's image of disciplined order masks layers of tension, fear, and quiet resentment. The combination of legal silencing and strict adherence to protocol has created an environment in which staff can comply without question, yet live in a constant state of apprehension. For historians, journalists, and the public, these accounts illuminate the thin line between ritualized obedience and personal subjugation, a line that, in Andrew's case, seems to have been tested repeatedly. The hidden costs of such behavior are not limited to staff alone, however. As these stories emerge, one cannot help but ask, how does a scandal like this resonate at the very top? The answer begins to reveal itself when we consider the stakes for King Charles III. Could Andrew's private actions, long confined behind palace walls, now threaten the stability and image of the monarchy itself? Let's delve into the details. The ripple effect. For King Charles III, every public misstep by Prince Andrew carries weight far beyond personal embarrassment. Andrew's controversies, from allegations of misconduct to reports of authoritarian behavior behind palace walls, are not isolated incidents. They reverberate across the monarchy, testing its credibility and stability. While Charles ascended the throne with careful attention to modernization and public trust, his brother's actions threatened to cast shadows over an institution striving to maintain relevance in a skeptical world. The stakes are not merely reputational, they are deeply political. Monarchies survive on a delicate balance of public perception and historical reverence. Scandals involving members of the royal family can quickly erode that balance, turning centuries of carefully curated tradition into points of public criticism. Andrew's diminished role, stripped titles, and high-profile legal scrutiny amplify the contrast between the dignity expected of the monarchy and the very human flaws that emerge behind closed doors. Each resurfaced story, each new allegation, is a reminder that the royal family is not immune to the same scrutiny applied to anyone else. Except here, the stakes are exponentially higher. Public opinion is particularly unforgiving when privileges seem unearned. Andrew's actions, whether reported as eccentric demands of staff or associations with controversial figures, feed into narratives of entitlement and unaccountability. For Charles, this presents a dilemma: how to uphold loyalty to a family member while protecting the crown's legitimacy. A misstep in response, appearing too lenient or too harsh, risks alienating the public or creating internal friction within the royal household. In an age where transparency is demanded and social media amplifies every detail, Charles must navigate a minefield of optics and influence. Beyond the headlines, the impact on the institution's day-to-day functioning is subtle but real. Staff morale, internal cohesion, and operational efficiency can all be affected by ongoing scandals. A family member whose behavior generates anxiety or mistrust can inadvertently create ripple effects. Aides distracted by managing crises, senior royals cautious in their public engagements, and advisors forced to prioritize damage control over strategic initiatives. For a monarch like Charles, whose vision involves both continuity and careful modernization, the distractions posed by Andrew's controversies represent an ongoing challenge to effective leadership. The monarchy also faces long-term implications for succession and public engagement. Younger royals and the wider public observe how crises are handled, forming opinions that influence trust and loyalty. Every misstep can become a cautionary tale, a lesson in accountability, or the lack thereof. In Andrew's case, the very public nature of some allegations, combined with internal secrecy, complicates Charles's task of presenting a coherent, responsible image of the monarchy. It raises uncomfortable questions about internal governance, family discipline, and the limits of privilege. Financial and institutional pressures add another layer of complexity. While the monarchy receives public funding and enjoys global interest, scandals risk affecting sponsorship, tourism, and charitable engagement. Negative attention can strain resources and limit the reach of initiatives designed to enhance the crown's public role. In a modern context where trust is currency, each controversy must be weighed not only in human terms, but also in the tangible effects it has on institutional sustainability. Even as Charles works to project calm and continuity, the shadow cast by Andrew is a constant reminder of the fragile nature of royal authority. Public sentiment is rarely static, and perception can shift dramatically with every media cycle. For the king, managing the fallout is an ongoing exercise in diplomacy, discretion, and image management, an effort that requires careful calculation at every step. Andrew's scandals are no longer merely his own. They ripple outward, shaping narratives that could define Charles's reign in the eyes of history, the media, and the public alike. So does Andrew merit any continued role in royal life? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.